My name is Dick Kilburg.
And your connection to coaching is quite extensive, but if you could fill it in for me.
I started to learn how to coach in the late 1960s, and more or less in all the jobs and activities that I've engaged over the last 42, 44 years have contained some aspects of coaching or other.
And you came from what academic background originally?
Doctoral degree in clinical and community psychology.
How did you first get interested in coaching?
It's a very interesting story. The University of Pittsburgh at the time I was attending in the community psychology program had hired a couple of new faculty, one of whom was a guy by the name of Tony Bruskowski, who was faculty member and turned into a colleague and a friend. And in my second year in graduate school in the early winter of 1970, he arranged to do a consultation with a junior high school in the city of Pittsburgh. And it was about 18 months after the Martin Luther King riots. And it was a racially divided and torn institution.
An inner city school?
Not inner city, but Pittsburgh's, 50 square miles roughly. So it's not a huge city. It's not like Los Angeles, but not a suburban school. He only allowed 10 students into the class, and we became a consulting team. And he took us into the school, and we assaulted it. And we did everything that we could think of, and that contemporary psychology and organizational intervention basically suggested we could do in an institution to help it. So everything from T-grouping the teachers, and he was coaching the school principal, and we would do token economies in classrooms, and the class itself was organized around the discussion of our work as a consulting team. I was 23 and 24 years old when all of that started.
And coaching as a profession wasn't even thought of at that time, really?
Well, coaching in the modern parlance, there was no formal literature about it, but coaching has been part of consulting and part of leadership really since leadership really kind of emerged formally as a human discipline. All of the flurry about it is an academic discipline, and now as a profession or a set of professional services to be rendered is all being driven by the fact that there are now markets for it that will pay reasonable rates of return for people to provide the service. So
definitionally it didn't exist, but in practice, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, when people started doing, I did for a paper that I did for one of the special issues of the Journal of Consulting Psychology, I looked at the history of consulting and what available literature there was on the history of consulting and contemporary psychology or contemporary consulting practice really began in France at probably the middle stages of the Industrial Revolution. And so they started hiring people who were primarily engineers by training to consult with people who wanted to open mines and people who wanted to build roads and people who wanted to build railroads. And they went and hired expertise. It was the expertise-centered model of consultation. And so rich people, entrepreneurs, and governments would hire experts to consult with them about how to do things. And that's how consulting really started in the contemporary frame well over 150 years ago.
How do you see the transition from that more traditional consulting model, which does still exist in many places, into more of a coaching frame as we see it today?
I think that the expert model of consultation is still the primary model of consultation. All the big consulting firms are still driven largely by we're going to do accounting work. We're going to do basically numbers and process checking for you. And what they discovered at the end of the 80s, early 90s, was that there are other forms of work that the accounting or the expert services could open up to them. And so they started doing boutique work like strategy formation, and then they started doing things like organizational change. And then the new IT systems came along, so they started doing IT integration work in consultation with the big IT firms who were selling ERPs and other kinds of large-scale enterprise software. So the consulting field in general has migrated in that direction. And along with virtually any large-scale intervention, if it's an audit of your books, the people who are doing the work have to talk to executives. And over the course of about the last 30 years, plus minus, talking to executives about these kinds of things and then about themselves has become kind of a sub-discipline of the consulting field. And coaching in the modern parlance really emerged in probably the early to mid-1980s. And it arose in conjunction with the development of leadership development programs, formalized leadership development programs starting at CCL. And coming out of some of their experiences in the invention of some of their programs and the kind of co-creation at about the same time of multi-rater reviews of leadership performance. So you had the emergence of, well, we're finally getting executives into and want to be leaders into formal training programs where they're studying some of these disciplines coming out of the late 60s and 70s when organization development, leadership theory, schools of management, schools of administration were literally exploding across the country and across the world. So all this stuff is torn up in a ferment, and then they invent multi-rater reviews and formal training programs. And people were attending the program and says, well, it's nice that you've given me all of this data, but how do I put it to use? And that's where the kind of the formalization of coaching in and around individual development started to emerge out of CCL, and then a couple of the firms that were built in and around multi-rater reviews and other instrumentation began to offer services to interpret and to work with leaders about their feedback. And that was mid-80s when all of that started, and the first boutique firms started up. And then that's when the first two dissertations were published on coaching in Minnesota.
And where do you fit into that history personally and in your own work?
Well, I mean, as I said, I started doing coaching in my work in graduate school, and then I defended my dissertation on a Friday in December of 1972, and the following Monday walked into an assistant professorship at the University of Pittsburgh in the Department of Psychiatry, and they gave me the responsibility for a community mental health center team with 13 full-time professionals, including a physician psychiatrist that reported to me and said, you're now responsible with this team for the mental health of 26,000 people.
I think that's called learning on the hoof.
Yeah, I think it's called basically stretch experience.
Yeah.
But, you know, I had what you can think of as the confidence or overconfidence of youth, and a lot of ideas, and we took that team, and when I became the director, they were about 98% invested in traditional clinical services. And after 3 years, we were down to about 65% direct clinical services. And we had consulting and coaching relationships with every school, every church, every social service agency outside of our own in those two communities in Pittsburgh. So we really started to hit the institutions and work on organizational change and leadership development. That was 1972 to 1975.
Well, and here we are all these years later, and multidisciplinary has become sort of a catchphrase with coaching, and you've got it back in 1972.
Well, and so people think everything's new and everything's fresh, and and people, you know, it's the rhetoric of sales. You know, somebody has written something, somebody wants to sell something, and so something has to be brand new. It's never been thought of, it's never been done. When you really go back and explore the history of it, it's been around for a long time, and what people are doing is repackaging it, rebranding it, relabeling it, and there's nothing wrong with that. The way I respond to it is with a profound wish that they were a little more, let's just say, historically anchored. They could still put their own labels on it, but they would be able to articulate how this fits into the time scale of, you know, of what happens. And
it's an evolutionary process, and it's pulling in all that history and everybody else's work that contributes to it. It's not like it came down brand new today.
Of course.
Right.
You know, so and then the other place where I fit in is that in 1994. I'm sitting in my office at Hopkins. We're starting an internal organization development unit. And I was really, really clear as we started it, and with my colleagues, that we wanted a formalized executive coaching program as part of that. And I thought, well, you know, I want to get the literature. I went and looked at the literature. There was only really one published article on executive coaching in the psychological literature in 1994. And so I called Skip Leonard, who is the editor of the Journal of Consulting Psychology, the Consulting Psychology Journal, and I said to him, what about doing a special issue on executive coaching? He said, funny thing, I was just thinking about that. Would you be willing to edit it? And I said, I'd be delighted to. And so over the course of the next 18 months, between the people I knew and the people that Skip knew, we invited about a dozen people to basically write the first 12 articles that were published in any formal literature on executive coaching. And then over the course of the next roughly 10 years, we published 4 more special issues. So in the first 100 articles on executive coaching in the literature, those special issues were about 60% of the articles that were produced, really kind of delineating what the practice was, what people thought was theoretical anchors in history, et cetera, by kind of the leading lights in many of the people who really established the first theoretical studies and the first empirical studies in the field.
And you build a base.
Well, and then what happens is that other people start to write and publish, and ICF gets born, and all the coaching associations get born, and new journals get built, and books get published left and right, and then an industry is born. And you go from a couple of very small boutique companies, largely spun out of CCL, to now virtually all the major consulting firms have kind of arms where they're providing coaching, and you have a conference every year where you have 750 people coming, and you could probably have 1,200 or 1,500 people coming. And
yeah, from all different disciplines. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and that's the delightful thing. I've made the argument in psychology for a long time that we should be in no rush to regulate the practice of coaching. You know, and there's lots of stuff happening inside of the marketplace of coaching where people are trying to carve up the turf and gain exclusive entry, to exclude people, one group or one. And we're still pre-disciplinary in terms of coaching. I mean, although the last time I went into literature was probably 9 months ago, and I try and go in about twice a year, just kind of track what's happening. So we went 1994, where you could only find one reference on executive coaching. You go in last time, and there was 440 some citations. So that's over the course of a decade and a half, now closing in at the end of the second decade.
But that's still very, very new, and
Yeah,
very preliminary and evolutionary.
Very new. And so But you are seeing curricula develop. You're seeing largely for-profit institutions or continuing education programs associated with universities, because there's real money and people will pay a really significant dollar to go and learn something about it. And there's, I won't say zero anymore, but there are limited barriers to entry. So this is something that you can learn independent of your disciplinary or experiential background, and you can put yourself out there in the market and you can try and make a living on it. I think, quite frankly, the ferment of all of that right now is a very, very healthy thing, and the marketplace is going to figure out who knows how to do what and not. But there's already a lot of press in a variety of organizations and people calling for certification and licensure and this and that and the other thing. And I sit there and I look at it and I say, okay, show me the scientific literature that actually tells you that you've got a discipline and a research base to provide these services. And there may be 6 legitimate control variable articles in the literature, and then a whole bunch of mediocre to bad dissertations that basically suggest we're doing something positive. So I think it's something positive, and most people experience something positive out of it, and so why not just let people continue to experiment?
I love your languaging about the ferment of what's going on in it. I mean, that's what it feels like.
Yeah, so it's very rich time. And so the disciplines and the concepts that are being thrown into this, it's everything from, okay, we're going to coach, as we just saw, we're going to coach kids on obesity, or we're going to coach healthcare providers about how to coach patients, or coach families on obesity, and that's coaching. And then the stuff that I do, which is working next to senior executives about how they're actually leading very large organizations and trying to change them, and that's coaching. And when people were doing what we did back in the 1960s to 1970s, they're in classrooms and they're working with teachers, and that's coaching. And
we don't want to limit that down. That would be a bad thing. I'm agreeing with you.
That's my personal opinion, that in 20 years from now, 30 years from now, it may be a little more formal discipline, but secretly I hope not. Because I don't think that what you can think of as the disciplinization, the professionalization of knowledge has really been a healthy thing for the world. Been a healthy thing for professions who have been able to kind of block off access to markets. But I don't think it's necessarily been that helpful for the world.
Well, and I think we would be very hard-pressed to find one that became a profession within 2 decades or 3 decades.
Yeah, I think you can, because we know how to do it, all right, there's a pathway to professionalization. And some of the people inside coaching have participated in those pathways to creating a licensed discipline or a certified discipline. They're working really, really hard to try and do the same thing, bring the same thing to coaching. I think it's premature, and I think it's the wrong approach to things, but it's not going to stop people from doing it because they want to lock up markets. The rationalization they provide to it is really, this is going to protect the public. And certain institutions are asking questions like, well, who should we hire? Who's competent to do it? And so, what you got basically is groups of providers, groups of professionals that are saying, me. Exactly. You hire me, and I'll certify everybody else. And then you won't have to worry about it. Yeah, you can hire all my friends, And so there are inside games that institutions, organizations, and people play with regard to that. So it's all happening at the same time as we're inventing knowledge and trying to figure out what actually works.